Move him away from my daughter right now. The words cut through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin so sharply that even the flight attendants stopped moving for a second. Several passengers turned their heads. A businessman lowered his newspaper. Someone paused halfway through lifting a cup of coffee. The atmosphere inside Flight 782 from New York to Los Angeles suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the air itself had frozen. Catherine Reynolds stood beside her premium seat, one hand resting on the leather headrest, her expensive designer coat draped perfectly over her arm. Everything about her radiated status. The diamond watch on her wrist caught the soft cabin lights. The polished confidence in her voice suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Across from her sat Dr. Elijah Carter. He had boarded only minutes earlier and quietly taken the window seat assigned to him. He wore a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and a worn leather travel bag rested beneath the seat in front of him. Nothing about his appearance hinted at wealth or influence. To most people, he looked like an ordinary traveler at the end of a very long day. Elijah slowly lifted his eyes from the medical journal resting in his lap. He looked at Catherine, then at the young girl standing beside her. Sophie Reynolds could not have been older than 10. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and she clutched a small stuffed rabbit against her chest. Unlike her mother, she looked embarrassed rather than upset. The lead flight attendant approached carefully, maintaining the practiced smile airlines teach their employees. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Catherine folded her arms. "Yes, I requested a comfortable environment for my daughter. I don't want him sitting next to her." A faint murmur spread through nearby rows. The attendant glanced toward Elijah, then back at Catherine. "Ma'am, Mr. Carter is seated in his assigned seat." Catherine's expression tightened. "Then assign him another one." Elijah remained silent. Outside the oval window, the late afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and amber. The airport runway stretched endlessly beneath them. For a brief moment, the cabin seemed suspended between departure and confrontation. Sophie shifted uneasily. "Mom," she whispered, tugging lightly at Catherine's sleeve. Catherine ignored her. "I paid for first class," she continued. "I expect certain standards." The words lingered in the air. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elijah slowly closed his journal. His movements were calm, measured, almost gentle. There was no anger in his face. No challenge. No visible reaction at all. That somehow made the silence heavier. He simply stood and reached for his bag. "It's okay," he said quietly. His voice was deep and steady. "I can move." The flight attendant opened her mouth as if to protest, but Elijah offered a reassuring smile. "Really, it's fine." Catherine immediately relaxed, satisfied that the situation had been resolved. Sophie, however, looked directly at Elijah. There was confusion in her eyes, as though she sensed something the adults around her could not. Elijah stepped into the aisle and allowed another passenger to pass. As he moved toward the rear of the cabin, the golden sunlight streamed through the windows and briefly illuminated his face. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibilities far heavier than a travel bag. Yet he never once looked back. He never complained. He never defended himself. He simply walked away. What nobody on that airplane knew was that within the next 24 hours, Catherine Reynolds would discover that the quiet man she had dismissed so easily possessed something far more powerful than wealth, influence, or status. And by the time she realized who Elijah Carter truly was, everything she believed she controlled would already be slipping through her fingers. The aircraft climbed steadily above the East Coast, leaving behind a blanket of silver clouds that stretched across the horizon like an endless ocean. Inside the cabin, the earlier tension had faded into an uneasy quiet. Most passengers returned to their routines. Some opened laptops. Others reclined their seats and drifted into light sleep. The soft hum of the engines settled into the background like distant white noise. Elijah Carter sat alone several rows behind first class near the front of the main cabin. The seat was narrower, the legroom tighter, but he seemed completely unbothered. His leather bag rested beneath his feet. A half-finished bottle of water sat on the tray table. He stared out the window for a moment before reaching into his bag and pulling out a worn notebook. The cover showed years of use. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and names. Not business plans. Not investment strategies. They were stories. Names of families, children, veterans, teachers, small communities scattered across the country. Places most people never noticed. Elijah carefully reviewed each page, occasionally making notes in the margins. Across the aisle, an elderly woman glanced over curiously. She noticed photographs tucked between the pages. Smiling children standing beside newly built playgrounds. Families gathered in front of renovated homes. Young students holding scholarship certificates. The woman smiled. Elijah returned the smile politely before continuing his work. Meanwhile, several rows ahead, Catherine Reynolds was busy conducting business from 30,000 feet. Her tablet displayed financial reports, quarterly projections, and acquisition summaries. Numbers moved across the screen while she tapped through presentations with practiced efficiency. To Catherine, every hour represented opportunity. Every conversation had measurable value. Every relationship fit somewhere inside a balance sheet. Sophie sat beside her quietly coloring in a small activity book provided by the airline. Occasionally, she glanced back toward the cabin as if searching for someone. Finally, she looked up. "Mom." Catherine did not lift her eyes from the screen. "What is it? Why did that man move?" Catherine sighed. "Because it was better for everyone." Sophie frowned. "He seemed nice." Catherine finally looked up. "Sweetheart, sometimes you have to be careful about people." Sophie stared at her coloring page. Something about the answer did not feel right. She remembered the man's calm expression. The way he smiled even after being embarrassed in front of strangers. The way he never argued. Her crayon stopped moving. Several hours later, the cabin lights dimmed as evening approached. Golden sunlight poured through the windows, turning the clouds outside into rivers of fire. Most passengers paused to admire the view. Even Catherine closed her tablet for a moment. Far behind her, Elijah remained focused on his notebook. A flight attendant approached his row carrying a small cup of coffee. "Compliments of the lady in row 14, she said quietly. Elijah looked surprised. The elderly woman across the aisle gave a small wave. Elijah thanked her warmly. The woman smiled. "You reminded me of my husband," she said. "Always helping people without needing credit." Elijah lowered his eyes modestly. "I still have a lot to learn." The woman laughed softly. "The people who say that usually do." Outside, daylight slowly disappeared beyond the western horizon. The aircraft continued toward Los Angeles. No one on board realized that events already set in motion on the ground were moving faster than the plane itself. And while Catherine Reynolds focused on protecting everything she had built, forces beyond her control were quietly beginning to reshape her future. By the time the aircraft began its gradual descent toward Los Angeles, darkness had settled over most of the country. Tiny clusters of city lights shimmered thousands of feet below like scattered stars. Inside the cabin, passengers stretched, gathered their belongings, and prepared for arrival. Catherine Reynolds reopened her tablet for what felt like the 20th time that day. Work had always been her comfort zone. Numbers behaved predictably. Markets followed patterns. Companies could be acquired, restructured, and improved. People, in her experience, were far less reliable. For nearly 15 years, Catherine had built Reynolds Biotech into one of the fastest-growing pharmaceutical companies in the country. Business magazines featured her on their covers. Television networks invited her to speak about leadership. Investors trusted her judgment. Employees feared disappointing her. Success had become more than an achievement. It had become part of her identity. Looking out the window, she watched the distant lights of Southern California slowly grow larger. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to finalize the largest partnership in her company's history. The agreement would expand Reynolds Biotech into dozens of new markets and secure its position for years to come. The projected value exceeded $800 million. The board was excited. Analysts were optimistic. Catherine considered it the crowning achievement of her career. Across the aisle, Sophie had fallen asleep with her head resting against a travel pillow. Her stuffed rabbit remained tucked beneath one arm. For a moment, Catherine softened. She brushed a loose strand of hair away from her daughter's face and smiled faintly. Moments like these were rare. Most weeks were consumed by meetings, flights, and conference calls. Sophie often spent more time with tutors and caretakers than with her mother. Catherine knew it. She simply believed she was building a better future for her child. The seatbelt sign illuminated overhead as the captain announced their final approach. Passengers straightened in their seats. Engines adjusted their pitch. The aircraft gently banked toward the city. Several rows behind them, Elijah Carter closed his notebook and slipped it carefully back into his bag. He appeared completely unconcerned with the arrival. Calm seemed to follow him the way shadows follow sunlight. A flight attendant stopped briefly beside his seat. "Thank you again for helping earlier with that elderly passenger," she said quietly. Elijah smiled. She just needed someone to reach her medication bag. Most people ignored her. "Most people are busy," Elijah replied. The attendant nodded thoughtfully before continuing down the aisle. Unknown to Catherine, a very different conversation was taking place nearly 2,000 miles away. Inside a sleek conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, a group of executives reviewed a final ethics assessment connected to the partnership she planned to sign the next morning. A thick report sat open on the polished table. Several pages were marked with notes and recommendations. At the bottom of the final review was a signature that had already influenced decisions affecting billions of dollars. The name was simple: Dr. Elijah Carter. Back on the airplane, neither Catherine nor Sophie knew that the quiet man they had encountered only hours earlier was connected to the future of Reynolds Biotech in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. As the wheels touched the runway and the cabin erupted with relieved applause from a few travelers, Catherine gathered her belongings with complete confidence. She believed tomorrow would be the beginning of her greatest victory. She had no idea it would become the day everything started to change. Catherine woke before sunrise in her suite overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city still wrapped in pale morning haze. The sky carried soft shades of silver and gold as traffic slowly awakened below. She stood beside the glass holding a cup of coffee, mentally rehearsing the presentation she would deliver in just a few hours. Everything was prepared. Every projection had been reviewed. Every legal document had been approved. Every executive involved in the partnership had confirmed attendance. Today was supposed to be perfect. Across the city, Elijah Carter sat alone at a quiet table inside a modest hotel restaurant. A notebook rested beside his breakfast plate. Sunlight spilled across the pages as he reviewed several reports delivered overnight. He moved carefully through each document, occasionally making notes with a fountain pen. Around him, no one seemed to recognize him. He appeared completely ordinary, a man having breakfast before a busy day. Yet every report on the table represented decisions that would affect thousands of lives. At 9 o'clock sharp, Catherine entered the headquarters of Pacific Health Ventures. The building rose more than 40 stories above the city, its glass exterior reflecting the bright California morning. Executives greeted her warmly. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying folders and tablets. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. This deal had been discussed for nearly a year. The conference room itself felt more like a command center than a meeting space. Screens lined the walls. Financial projections glowed across polished displays. Catherine took her seat at the center of the table, confident and composed. Sophie remained with a private caretaker elsewhere in the building while the meeting proceeded. One by one, key stakeholders joined the room. Then something unexpected happened. A senior executive entered carrying a sealed envelope. His expression looked unusually serious. Quietly, he handed the envelope to the chairman. The chairman opened it and began reading. Seconds passed, then a minute. The energy in the room shifted almost immediately. Conversation stopped. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. Catherine noticed the change. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The chairman lowered the document slowly. "We have received an updated ethics assessment this morning." Catherine frowned. The assessment was completed weeks ago. Apparently, additional information was reviewed. A strange silence settled over the room. Air conditioning hummed softly overhead. Somewhere outside, a distant helicopter crossed the skyline. Catherine felt the first hint of discomfort. The chairman continued reading. Several concerns had been identified regarding leadership culture, public conduct, and organizational values. None of the observations involved finances. None involved products. Yet the report carried extraordinary weight because of the organization that issued it. Pacific Health Ventures relied heavily on independent ethics evaluations before approving strategic partnerships. Catherine leaned forward. "Who issued the revision?" The chairman glanced down at the signature page. His eyes narrowed slightly. Dr. Elijah Carter. The name meant nothing to several people in the room, but not to everyone. A few executives immediately straightened in their seats. One quietly exhaled. Another lowered his gaze toward the table. Catherine noticed their reactions. "Who is he?" she asked. No one answered immediately. The silence itself felt unsettling. Finally, the chairman spoke. He chairs one of the most respected healthcare foundations in the country. His recommendations influence billions in grants, investments, and partnerships every year. For the first time that morning, Catherine felt uncertainty creep into her thoughts. Outside the conference room windows, sunlight reflected off neighboring towers. The city looked exactly the same. Yet something invisible had begun to shift beneath the surface, and she was only beginning to realize how significant that shift might become. Catherine felt every eye in the conference room settle on her. The confidence that had carried her through countless negotiations suddenly felt less certain. She reached for the report and began turning pages herself. The document was thorough, professional, calm. There were no personal attacks, no dramatic accusations. That somehow made it worse. Each observation was supported by examples, interviews, and documented patterns. Leadership culture, public conduct, employee feedback, community engagement, corporate values. Catherine's jaw tightened as she read. "This cannot affect the partnership," she said firmly. "Our financial performance exceeds every requirement." No one immediately responded. The chairman folded his hands. Financial performance was never the only requirement. Across the table, several executives avoided eye contact. One adjusted his glasses. Another quietly closed a presentation folder that had been prepared for the signing ceremony. Catherine could feel the atmosphere changing minute by minute. What had begun as a celebration now felt like a review, a test, a judgment she had never expected. "Who requested this revision?" she asked. The foundation conducted an independent review after receiving new information. What information? The chairman hesitated. Public behavior that raised concerns regarding organizational leadership and ethical standards. Catherine stared at him. The answer felt frustratingly vague. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Another message. Then another. And another. Her chief communications officer. Her legal advisor. 2 board members. The notifications arrived so quickly they stacked on top of one another. A cold sensation settled in her chest. She opened the first message. A video clip had already begun circulating online. The recording was short, less than 2 minutes. Yet Catherine immediately recognized the setting. The airplane, her seat, her voice. Someone had captured the entire interaction. The angle came from several rows away, but the audio was clear, crystal clear. She watched herself demand that Elijah Carter be moved. She heard the uncomfortable silence that followed. She watched him quietly gather his belongings and leave without argument. The video ended with Sophie looking back toward him as he walked away. Catherine stared at the screen. The room suddenly felt warmer, brighter, smaller. Her communications officer had attached a brief note. Media inquiries increasing rapidly. Investors requesting comment. Social media engagement exceeding 1 million views. Situation escalating. Catherine lowered the phone slowly. For years, she had controlled narratives, managed headlines, directed public perception. Now events were moving without her. Across the table, another executive checked his own device. Then another. News traveled quickly in the modern world. Faster than contracts. Faster than meetings. Faster than reputations could recover. "This is ridiculous," Catherine said. One interaction does not define an entire company. The chairman remained calm. Perhaps not. But leadership often reveals itself through small moments. Silence followed. Through the towering windows, Los Angeles sparkled beneath the midday sun. Cars flowed through distant streets. Life continued normally outside. Inside the room, however, something important was slipping away. Catherine sensed it before anyone spoke the words. The chairman finally closed the report. Pacific Health Ventures will postpone the partnership pending further review. The sentence landed softly. No raised voices. No dramatic announcement. Yet its impact was immediate. $800 million. Months of preparation. Years of planning. All suspended with a single decision. Catherine sat motionless. For the first time in a very long time, she was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Catherine left the conference room without speaking. The hallway outside felt strangely quiet despite the hundreds of employees moving through the building. Conversations seemed distant, Footsteps echoed across polished marble floors. Sunlight poured through the towering glass walls, casting long reflections that stretched across the corridor like invisible barriers. For years she had walked through places like this with complete certainty. Today, every step felt heavier. Her phone continued vibrating with new messages. Investors wanted answers. Journalists wanted statements. Board members wanted emergency meetings. Catherine silenced the device and slipped it into her purse. For the first time in a long while, she did not want to hear anyone's opinion. She stepped outside onto a private terrace overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Warm afternoon air brushed against her face. Below, traffic flowed through the city with mechanical precision. Thousands of people continued their lives completely unaware of the storm unfolding around her. Catherine rested her hands against the railing and stared at the skyline. The postponement alone would cost millions. Stock analysts would react. Competitors would notice. Shareholders would become nervous. Yet none of those concerns bothered her as much as a single question she could not stop asking herself. Why had that man remained so calm? She remembered the airplane, the silence, the way he simply stood, gathered his belongings, and walked away. No anger, no argument, no attempt to embarrass her in return. The memory unsettled her more now than it had the day before. Meanwhile, several miles away, Elijah sat in a small community center near East Los Angeles. The building was modest. The paint on the exterior walls showed signs of age. Children's artwork decorated the hallways. Folding chairs lined a multi-purpose room where volunteers organized educational programs for local families. Elijah listened as a young teacher described challenges facing students who lacked access to technology. He asked questions, took notes, offered suggestions. No cameras followed him. No reporters waited outside. There were no headlines. Only people trying to improve lives one small step at a time. As the meeting ended, a little boy approached carrying a science project made from cardboard and paint. Elijah knelt beside him and studied the display carefully. The boy smiled with pride when Elijah complimented his work. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it carried a warmth that money could never purchase. Back at the hotel, Sophie sat by the window of her suite watching the afternoon sunlight fade across the city. She had overheard enough conversations to understand that something important had happened. When Catherine finally returned, Sophie immediately looked up from her book. "Mom." Catherine forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie hesitated. Was that man on the airplane really important? Catherine paused. The question lingered between them. Outside, the sky shifted toward evening, filling the horizon with soft shades of orange and gold. "Yes," Catherine admitted quietly. Sophie looked down at her hands. He seemed important before anybody knew who he was. Catherine felt those words settle deep inside her. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of city traffic far below. And for the first time since everything began to unravel, Catherine started to wonder whether the greatest loss she faced was not the partnership, the money, or the headlines. Perhaps the real loss was realizing how many times she had failed to see the value of a person before learning their title. The following morning brought a different kind of silence. News coverage continued to spread across business networks, financial publications, and social media platforms. Analysts debated the future of Reynolds Biotech. Commentators discussed leadership, accountability, and public perception. Yet the person at the center of the discussion remained almost entirely absent from the conversation. Elijah Carter had not given interviews. He had not posted statements. He had not responded publicly at all. That fact intrigued Catherine more than anything else. By mid-morning, she sat alone in a private conference room reviewing information her team had gathered overnight. For the first time, she was seeing a fuller picture of the man she had dismissed so casually. The file was thick, much thicker than she expected. She turned page after page. Medical degrees earned with honors. Years of work in underserved communities. National healthcare initiatives. Scholarship programs. Children's hospitals. Veteran rehabilitation projects. Affordable housing partnerships. Rural clinic expansions. The list seemed endless. Every few pages contained photographs. Elijah standing beside teachers. Elijah helping launch community programs. Elijah sitting with families. Elijah speaking at medical conferences. Yet in every image, he appeared exactly the same as he had on the airplane. Calm, humble, Uninterested in attention, Catherine slowly closed the folder and stared through the conference room window. The realization was impossible to ignore now. She had not misjudged a wealthy investor. She had not misjudged a powerful executive. She had misjudged a human being whose character had been visible long before his accomplishments were known. Meanwhile, across the city, Elijah attended a meeting at the headquarters of the Carter Foundation. The building itself was surprisingly modest compared to organizations of similar influence. Staff members moved through hallways carrying reports and grant applications. There were no extravagant displays, no luxury offices. Resources were directed outward rather than inward. During the meeting, one of Elijah's advisors carefully placed a newspaper on the table. The headline referenced the controversy surrounding Reynolds Biotech. "Would you like to issue a statement?" the advisor asked. Elijah glanced briefly at the article before sliding it aside. "No, people are asking whether your recommendation was influenced by the incident." Elijah folded his hands. The recommendation was based on the report, nothing else. Elijah looked toward the window where sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings. People reveal themselves in moments when they believe nobody important is watching. The room grew quiet. No one argued. They understood exactly what he meant. Later that afternoon, Catherine received another unexpected update. Pacific Health Ventures had agreed to one final review meeting before making a permanent decision. It would be her last opportunity to address the concerns raised in the assessment. The meeting would include foundation representatives. And for the first time since everything began, she would come face to face with Elijah Carter again. Catherine read the message twice. Her pulse quickened. A week ago, she would have approached such a meeting as a negotiation. A challenge to win. A problem to solve. Now it felt different. Outside her office, sunlight slowly faded across the Los Angeles skyline. Long shadows stretched between the towers. Somewhere beyond those buildings, a man she barely knew had become the mirror she could no longer avoid looking into. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she was willing to face the reflection honestly. Catherine arrived 20 minutes early. The conference center overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and morning sunlight shimmered across the water beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room itself was quiet except for the faint sound of waves rolling against the distant shoreline. A long table stretched through the center of the room. Folders had already been placed at each seat. Fresh coffee steamed from silver carafes. Everything looked professional, orderly, controlled. Yet Catherine felt none of the confidence she normally carried into meetings like this. She sat alone reviewing her notes, but the words seemed distant. Financial projections, strategic plans, growth forecasts. For the first time, none of it felt like the most important thing she needed to say. A few minutes later, the doors opened. Representatives from Pacific Health Ventures entered first, followed by several foundation advisors. Then Elijah Carter stepped into the room. He wore the same quiet composure she remembered from the airplane. No expensive display of authority. No attempt to command attention. Yet every conversation seemed to pause naturally as he entered. Catherine stood. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The room settled into silence. Then Elijah offered a polite nod and took his seat. The meeting began with formal reviews and discussions. Reports were examined. Questions were asked. Concerns were addressed. Nearly an hour passed before the chairman finally turned toward Catherine. "Before we conclude," he said, "is there anything else you would like to add?" Catherine looked around the table. Then she slowly closed her folder. The prepared speech she had rehearsed was suddenly meaningless. She drew a careful breath. "Yes," she said quietly. The room became still. Catherine turned toward Elijah. "I owe you an apology." No one moved. No one interrupted. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished table between them. "When we met on that flight, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed things I had no right to assume. I believed status mattered more than character. I was wrong." Her voice remained steady, but every word carried genuine weight. "The truth is, I did not lose an opportunity because of a report. I created this situation myself long before that meeting ever happened." Elijah listened without expression, allowing her to finish. Catherine lowered her eyes briefly. "I am sorry." The silence that followed felt longer than it actually was. Outside, a gull drifted across the blue horizon beyond the glass. Finally, Elijah spoke. "Thank you." That was all. No lecture. No humiliation. No attempt to make her feel smaller. Just two simple words. Catherine looked up, Surprised, Elijah folded his hands. People make mistakes. What matters is what they learn from them. Several people around the table exchanged thoughtful glances. The tension that had filled the room began to ease. The chairman looked toward Elijah. Do you believe progress is possible? Elijah smiled faintly. I always believe progress is possible. The answer seemed to change something, not only for Catherine, but for everyone present. The conversation that followed was different from any meeting Catherine had ever attended. It was no longer about protecting a deal. It was about rebuilding trust, about culture, about values, about the kind of leadership that could influence lives beyond quarterly reports. And as the morning sunlight continued filling the room, Catherine realized that the greatest opportunity before her was not the partnership she had nearly lost. It was the chance to become someone better than the person who had boarded that airplane only a few days earlier. 3 months later, the world looked very different. Spring sunlight washed across the city as people filled sidewalks, parks, and outdoor cafes. Headlines had moved on to newer stories, newer controversies, newer successes. Yet some changes had remained. Inside the headquarters of Reynolds Biotech, the atmosphere felt lighter than it once had. New community partnerships had been established. Employee advisory groups had been created. Scholarship programs were being funded in neighborhoods that had previously been overlooked. The transformation had not happened overnight, and it had not been perfect, but it was real. Catherine understood now that trust could not be purchased the way companies acquired assets. It had to be earned, one decision at a time. Late one afternoon, she stood beside the large window of her office watching golden sunlight reflect across nearby buildings. A framed photograph sat on her desk. Not an award, not a magazine cover. It was a simple picture Sophie had taken during a community volunteer event. In the photograph, children laughed while planting trees in a neighborhood park. Catherine smiled every time she looked at it. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Sophie stepped inside carrying a folder from school. Mom, are you busy? Catherine immediately set her work aside. Never too busy for you. Sophie grinned and crossed the room. Moments like this had become more common. The success Catherine valued most no longer appeared on quarterly reports. It appeared in conversations she once rushed through and relationships she once neglected. Across town, Elijah Carter walked through a community health center that had recently opened its doors. Families filled the waiting area. Nurses greeted patients by name. Volunteers organized educational materials near the entrance. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the bright interior. Elijah paused near a wall displaying photographs of supporters who had helped make the project possible. Near the center hung a new picture. It showed community leaders, educators, medical staff, and local volunteers standing together during the opening ceremony. Catherine appeared, in the back row beside several students. Elijah smiled softly and continued walking. He never cared much about recognition. The work itself was always enough. Later that evening, as the sun drifted toward the horizon, Catherine and Sophie visited a public garden overlooking the ocean. The air carried the scent of salt and blooming flowers. Waves rolled gently against the shore below the cliffs. Families strolled along winding pathways lined with trees. Sophie pointed toward the water. Look! In the distance, an airplane crossed the sky, its silver outline glowing against the orange light. Catherine followed it with her eyes. For a moment, she remembered another flight, another seat, another choice. The memory no longer filled her with embarrassment alone. It reminded her how quickly assumptions could blind people to the humanity standing right in front of them. The sky deepened into shades of gold, amber, and soft blue. A cool breeze moved through the trees, carrying the sound of leaves rustling overhead. Sophie slipped her hand into her mother's. Catherine squeezed it gently. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Beyond the garden, beyond the city, beyond the headlines and business deals, life continued moving forward. And in the quiet glow of the fading sunlight, the lesson remained simple. Character reveals itself long before titles do. The people who change our lives are not always the ones we expect. Sometimes they are simply the ones who choose kindness when they have every reason not to. As the last light settled across the ocean, the world grew still, and the silence felt a little more like peace.